many women quit their careers to be homemakers and others fight fiercely for feminism, what is a woman's role in today's society? That's a topic in the spotlight today. Joining me in the studio is Dr. Sahel, who is a mother of 2 children and a gynecologist also. Welcome, Dr. Sahel. Lovely to have you here in the studio.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and it's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
From your perspective, what is the role of a woman?
Role of a woman, it's a very good question. To me, women are multitaskers. They can do anything they are expected to do, and as well as above and beyond what is expected of them. And there are certain things, even though we think that men and women, they work side by side, but there are certain things that women can do and men can't. And one of them is producing children, 9 months of pregnancy, and then giving birth. It is something that is only a privilege of being a woman. And not only that, after giving birth, they look after their families, they look after their children, they nurture them, do their upbringing slightly differently from what a man can do. So from that point of view, this is the most important task they do, in addition to the activities outside the household.
So it sounds like primarily you feel that the role of a woman is to be a nurturer and a homemaker. Is that correct?
This could be considered a primary role, but there are so many secondary roles a woman can do and does do in any society, be it a Muslim or a non-Muslim world.
And I mean, in our current times, there's a lot of debate on gender roles and male and female roles. And in the Western society today, we're having a lot of issues with men who are feeling very emasculated, and a lot of criticism of the feminism movement, which is saying that women are now being pulled away from traditional roles and, you know, being just totally, you know, leaving the domain of the home and feeling it's unimportant, which is having an impact on mental health. It's having an impact on society. We have high divorce rates, high mental health problems, and a lot of this can be brought back to the fact that the foundation of society, which is the home, is no longer being nurtured by women like it once was. What's your views on this?
I mean, the thing is that we can actually consider that, yes, historically, main role of women was to look after their families and not necessarily work outside, but and men were considered to be the breadwinners, and they were supposed to be the protectors of the family. But with evolving world, we are emerging, the life is advancing, there are so many challenges. And in order to compensate or cope with the challenges of life, it was not right for women to be bound to the household responsibilities only, because they had to work side by side with men. And also it may be that it's to be bound in the household, it's not always good for the mental health of women also. A lot of women, they're very ambitious, they want to work outside, they've got plans, and in order to restrict them to the household just because it's the job of a man was not fair. And yes, you're right that the divorce rate is high, mental health problems is going up, but that is, women should not be blamed for that, because it is about the awareness of women as well as men on how to run the life. I think the main reason why the society, the values are deteriorating is I think people are not understanding what is expected from a man and a woman. And it is very unfair to blame women for this role, because if a woman goes out to work, then men should also play a role to look after their families. And I think there has to be some modesty about how they act. And of course, neglect is one thing which should be avoided. So if a woman wants to work outside, then men should also participate in looking after the children. They can't expect that a woman works outside as well as at home, and men, they're only expected to work outside. I can give you my own example. My husband is also a medic. His responsibilities are equal to my responsibility as a doctor, and therefore it was not, if I wouldn't have been able to achieve my career if I didn't have participation from my husband, who was fully involved in looking after the children. And I sometimes look back and I reflect, and I think that most of the pick and drop from school was done by my husband rather than myself, and a part of me misses that. But if he wasn't there to support me, I would not have been able to fulfill my dreams and work in my role as a doctor, as a gynecologist. So I think a lot of credit I will give to my husband. So if I say I was more powerful and I was stronger and therefore, I should have gone out and neglect my children, then I think it would have resulted in a lot of complications amongst children. And I'm so proud to say that with us working side by side, we understood our roles, not necessarily as a man or a woman, as a couple, where we felt that it is both our responsibility to look after the children. And as a result, we've got, mashallah, both children. They are independent, they are both doctors, and I think they've got values and they know how to face the society. So I think if I started thinking that I'm more important than my husband, then I think my children would have been neglected.
You sound like you had quite a perfect setup, or a very nice balance. You had a very compromising husband who was able to facilitate the fact that you had this powerful role and you had this dynamic career. But this isn't necessarily the typical situation for many, many people. So it might not be the ideal set. I mean, for many couples where the woman insists upon working and wants to be working and the guy is also working, that can also cause a lot of conflict and difficulties as well, if you look at it on an average level.
I agree with that, but then, it is just about a mutual understanding, because there are some situations where women are more educated and they're more skilled. And in that situation, if the man insists that just because it's his role to be providing bread and butter for the family and should restrict the woman at home, I think in this world where there are so many financial challenges, I think it's just about understanding, a mutual understanding, and they have to understand what works best for that particular family. And I agree that some men actually they have this misogynist attitude where they feel that women should be looking after the household, and even if they work outside, it's not their job to be doing the cooking or house cleaning or any domestic work. I think that would create problem, and that will not only affect their personal relationships, but also children will be affected, because that is what gives rise to neglect and then mental health problems as a result, and relationship issues which may result in a divorce.
So as a working woman and a wife and a mother, did you take on that role then of the domestic sphere, of the primary responsibility for the domestic sphere? Did you take on more of that responsibility?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, as I said, I wouldn't have been able to achieve what I have achieved so far in my life, alhamdulillah, without the support of my husband.
What was his input? Was it support, or was it actual practical 50-50?
I mean, it's only fair to say that when we got married, I would say my husband was a spoiled brat. He was pampered and he was brought up in a way that most of our Pakistani or Asian men are. But I think he was very sensible, because he looked at me and felt that if I'm working, I'm looking after the children, and it will be very unfair for him to expect that I come home and start cooking. So he gradually, I didn't have to say it, he felt and he started doing the household chores without me asking for it. And I think that balance was very important for us to maintain the stability in our household.
What about the power dynamic? Being a powerful doctor, you have a strong personality, and that often comes by going out there in the world and having to deal with so many different situations and having to be confident, otherwise you can't survive in the working world. Has that ever impacted your marriage or your family life, do you feel?
I mean, I wouldn't say...
Has your husband had to kind of tone it down?
Well, to be honest with you, if I come across like a powerful personality, he is no less than myself. We both have got very strong personalities, and we both have got, we are both very opinionated. But of course, there is no household where we would say we don't have any conflicts. Conflicts do happen, but you just have to deal with it through conversations and dialogue, rather than fighting with each other to prove who is stronger than the other. I think it won't work if we are always in the battle of trying to win the other person. I think it's not fair.
So how do you do it? Because it sounds very inspiring and very enlightening hearing this from a Pakistani lady. This isn't the typical norm in many Pakistani households. How did you find that balance?
I mean, in the beginning,
that communication, that ability to be able to communicate effectively.
I mean, the thing is that if I say that when we got married, my husband was a proper Asian man, and for him to be going into the kitchen was not only something that he never imagined, but there was more pressure from your, in-laws and other people from his side of family, because they think he's not meant to be in the kitchen. He's not supposed to be doing the laundry or clean the house.
And especially a number of years back as well, right?
Absolutely. So it took a few years before actually. It's about the personalities. Human beings, they do have empathy. And when he felt that I may be overworked because I am trying to do too many things at a time, it just changed his mindset. And I think at one point, he didn't care about what other people thought. Because as a human being, you feel for others, and you look at somebody and say, what am I doing? Is it fair on my wife to be going straight into the kitchen after a busy day at work, coming home, and then starting the household work? I think the conscience wouldn't allow somebody who has got some brain, I would think. And I think it didn't take very long for him to start taking part in the household. And it just took a few years, but I think it didn't affect our children very much in terms of how we actually distributed the roles amongst each other. And like now my son, mashallah, I just feel that he's not got the mind of a typical Asian man, that it's the job of a woman to do the cooking and I should be sitting and watching telly. He's still, when he comes home, he's always helping in the kitchen, because this is what he has seen his dad doing. And I think it is very, very important that if you want to run a household in a calmer and a more stable way, men and women, they should basically chuck those gender roles that were historical and which mainly I think is a misconception of not even these third world countries, but also in the Western world also. Life is changing, challenges are increasing, and we just have to cope with that by mutual agreement.
So you mentioned chucking out gender roles, so you'd be quite happy for your husband to be the home husband and for you to be the primary breadwinner?
If that's what he wants to do and we are able to cope with that, I would have no problems.
Really?
But I don't think
Would you really not have any issues? Would you not feel less attracted to your husband if you came home, powerful from work and he was washing the dishes and hoovering and like, hey?
Well, personally, I'm an Asian woman as well, and I've not seen that happening when I was growing up. So for me, it will be a bit of a shock. But if our circumstances are such that he can afford not to work and I have to work harder, then maybe I'll have to think about it and accept it. But I think at the moment I won't want my husband to be sitting at home doing nothing and I'm just working outside, because that would not be a healthy environment. Because clearly for a man, it's their egos, he wouldn't be happy to be called a houseband. But if circumstances were such that we had young children and my work didn't allow me to look after them much and he was able to afford to take some time off work, then maybe that would have been acceptable. Because I see at workplace now, a lot of men are taking time off when they've got young children to allow their wives to work. And I think it should be acceptable. There should not be a stigma for men if they take up the domestic role when it is expected from their wives to be working. And more so, like for me, I was in training, and training requirements were not such that I could have taken a lot of time off to look after my children. And that is where we needed to share the work so that I could complete my training and our children were not neglected.
If you were to look back though, and you were to look at both the roles that you've obviously fulfilled in your life, one as a working professional in the esteemed position as a gynecologist and one as a mother, if you'd had to choose between those two, what was more fulfilling for you? To be a mother was a great feeling, and I still enjoy being a mother. But working was more for my satisfaction, because I had ambitions when I was doing medicine. I wanted to achieve something in my career. And if I was told that I can't fulfill my dreams, then I would have been more frustrated. And I would think that way our married life would have been more affected than what it was in reality. Because then if I was frustrated, I wouldn't have been able to look after my children the way I did. Because I was not worried about them. And you do need some
outlet as well. Because if you're only doing one thing all the time, then what is your life? What is the quality of life when you can't actually do what you wanted to do?
Could have been a lady of leisure, that wouldn't have appealed?
Well, I'm not someone who wanted to be a lady of leisure, because to me, this is not the purpose of being in this world. Once born, you have to do something for the universe. Important is the family, but apart from that, outside the family, you have to look at a broader picture. And if I had a skill where I could have given to the society, then I think it would have been unfair that I stayed at home and didn't share my skills with others.
Do you feel that you ever had to do too much work? Did you ever feel overwhelmed? Your own profession was quite, very demanding. Being a mother is very demanding. Creating a home is an intense thing in itself. Have you ever at times just thought, I could just quit on on the work, or it's too much?
I can only talk about myself, and never felt that I was at any point of my life I was overwhelmed or overburdened with either of my roles. As a mother, I loved being a mother. I loved looking after my kids. But at the same time, this is a work that I love. And because it is such a feeling of satisfaction that you're looking after patients with problems, and when you are able to do something which makes another human being better, that feeling, there's no match to that. And you come home and you feel that I've done that, and now I'm going to be looking after my kids. I think a balance was perfect. With age, of course, like there are moments where I feel a bit more exhausted, and I just think maybe I need a break. But you just do adjustments based on how you physically and mentally feel. But so far, touch wood, I've never actually felt that it's very difficult to run both the roles at the same time.
As a Muslim woman, often we hear that it's a man's role to be a protector and a provider. We're not ever really given a definitive, clear role on what a woman's position is. What do you feel, from an Islamic perspective, the role of a woman is?
I personally think that this is a huge misconception, mainly of a Western world, that Islam, it's a misogynist religion, because Islam gives equal rights to men and women. And if you read Quran, men and women are supposed to be working side by side. They've got equal rights. There is no such thing as denial of education to women, or if they want to work outside, they can't do. Because if you look at our Islamic history, we have so many examples where, starting from our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his wife Hazrat Khadija was a businesswoman, and that's how they met, because she saw our Prophet and she felt that he's a very sensible and a clever man, so she wanted him to run her business. And she, in fact, when he started doing it, she was so impressed with his personality that she's the one who proposed him for marriage. And likewise, there are so many other examples where Muslim women, they actually fought the wars along with their men, and so on and so forth. The history, Islamic history, is full of such examples. And therefore, this is a misconception that Muslim women, they are denied their rights and they are oppressed, and they are actually, they don't have any right to decide, even not only in the day-to-day life, but also if you look at Islamic rules or guidances, Muslim women, they have had more rights compared to what the Western women were offered up until 19th century. Even inheritance laws, if you look at it, Muslim women, they had more right to claim inheritance from their families and also from their husbands in cases of divorce, and so much so that they even have a right to divorce as well in certain circumstances. So I think perhaps the Western world, they're changing their concepts, because this misconception of Islam as a misogynist religion is absolutely incorrect, and I think we need to raise awareness among the Western world that they need to change their minds, because there are so many women who are Muslims who are working in this society in very, very important roles. So they only see a small fraction of women who in the remote areas in third world countries, but that is more a cultural thing rather than a religious thing. And same is in Western world also. If I'm not talking about the big cities, but if you go to the remote places, there are so many women who are only in their domestic roles and they're not allowed to go and work outside. So I think this is a misconception which needs to be corrected.
As a Pakistani woman, as a doctor, and obviously as a mother, what kind of response have you received from the Pakistani community? Because there aren't that many doctors within the Pakistani female community as there are in others.
I mean, the thing is that...
do you ever find that men are intimidated by you? Or do you...
I can't say that, but I have had comments from some of our Asian men friends who actually were making fun of my husband because they saw him cooking and they looked down upon him, but it didn't affect my husband's way of how he was dealing with things. So, but then I think with passage of time, I think Asian men are also changing their mentality and how they take men who take their domestic roles. So it's more accepted now than it used to be a few years back.
So you think that the role of men and women in marriage is one where they compromise, they support one another, and they find their own way together. And whether the woman wants to work or doesn't want to work, it's just about love and caring and supporting each other, I guess.
That is what a marriage should be, that it is about a mutual understanding of who does what. And if you do not actually consider each other's dreams and desires and wishes, then a household will be a disaster. Because suppressing a woman's dream and telling them that you can't go out because I'm doing the job, what kind of quality of life you are expecting? Because she'll be frustrated and she won't be able to show that kind of love that you would deserve, and therefore one has to understand that. So it's all about trust, respect, as well as faith in each other's abilities to run a household. So I think to run a good life, it is very important to give space to each other and allow them to do what they want to do. And
I think women today as well, in the Muslim world, Muslim women, and also in the secular countries, there's so much awareness, so much self-actualization and development and education and careers that we can't really go back to traditional roles anymore. That time is kind of past. And I personally feel that now going forward, it is about respect, love, compatibility and compromise, and that is the model for successful marriages in our current century and in future centuries.
I 100% agree. There is no such thing that women should be oppressed and be restricted to the four walls of their household. It's not. Otherwise, I mean, you won't be able to cope, not only necessarily for financial reasons, but also to be the role models for your next generation, because everyone has to work. Because if you don't work, what are you going to be giving to the society? And if you're not able to contribute towards the society, I feel that you are a burden, unless something is restricting you from taking that role.
So what would your advice be to young women watching this programme who are a bit confused about, because of the debate on gender roles, which is so prominent at the moment in the West, and also it's a very topical issue for Muslim women at the moment right now. What would your advice be to young women who are emerging into marriage and into the outside world? So
my advice to them will be, don't be hesitant in following your dreams, but don't try to overpower or dominate your male counterparts, because we both have separate roles, and you can't deny that in some aspects there are some things that men can do better from the physical aspect of things. Of course, women are more delicate than men, and if they're expecting the housework, which I tell you, I mean, I can't do any housework which is technical and all that. I'm always relying on my husband. So it won't make me less of a woman if I have to ask him for help where I can't do something. I think it has to be, the life has to be with the mutual agreement if you want to have better compatibility, and no one is trying to dominate one or the other. So a balance in life is much better, modesty in life is much better. So no one should be trying to prove one thing or the other to the other counterpart.
Can that really be achieved? Because men are biologically, there is some superiority there. And if you look at their psychological desires, men need respect. Women ultimately want to feel desired according to the latest kind of psychological revelations and insight into male and female behaviour. So men generally have an innate need to be leaders, whether they recognise it or not in our current times. And women generally are more attracted to their partners if they are strong, if they are protective, if they are providing. Do you not feel that there is, whatever we say, however we are moving forward, we are perhaps denying our innate psychology and innate womanhood by saying, no, this is about, complete equality, we're completely, yes, equal, the same, but the power is should be in sync. Can that ever really be achieved anyway?
Well, the thing is, one has to be aware, and that is why we are having this conversation, to understand what is the role of a man and a woman. And of course, like, there are some things that as I said before, women can't do, and there are some things that men can't do. Men can't give birth. Women can't do some physical work. I mean, they do, even when you look at the examples of women working in rural areas in third world countries. I mean, I can only talk about Pakistan. They work as laborers and all that. But there are some restrictions or limitations on either role. So it's about mutual understanding of who can do this better than the other, and find an agreement without trying to dominate the other gender. Because yes, gender roles, the concept of gender roles is there, but there is no such thing that men can't do this and women can't do this. It has to be an agreement, and we all are different. Some women, they are more feminine than others, and therefore if their partners have got that kind of understanding, then respect their desires and wishes, rather than trying to tell them that this is the gender role. So there is no such boundaries as gender role. It's about mutual understanding of who can do what.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you so much for all your insight and insight into all your life experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much once again for inviting me.
That was my interview with Dr. Sahel, who is a gynecologist and a mother of 2 children, who gave us great insight into her experiences as a modern Pakistani woman who has both traditional and modern values. Joining me on video link is Aisha Wright, a psychotherapist and an author who has worked with many young women on the topic of womanhood. Hi Aisha, thank you for joining me on the programme. You're a psychotherapist and an author, and you've worked with a lot of young Muslim women on the area of womanhood and what it means to be a woman. What is your perspective on this subject of womanhood, especially in these current times that we're living in, where gender roles are fiercely under debate?
Yeah, Aisha, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it's also made even more interesting because of the different stages which women go throughout their lives, from girlhood into teenagedom to becoming a young woman, and then what middle age means for us as well, and also what old age. And because we have a secular nature which is different to men, I feel that this is something that women find themselves reflecting on a lot, because of our different cycles of also becoming wife and also a mother, and then what it means for children to leave home. And then also in this current time where it's so much easier for women to enter education and enter into career, in a time where in the whole world we didn't have this kind of perhaps potentiality in the broadness of what that is within our society. So it's a relevant question, and I don't know if one can ever find the answer, but certainly it's worth looking over and reflecting on.
From your work with Muslim women and from the work you did with them on womanhood, what was it that you used to talk to them about? And you used to cover areas such as marriage, etc.
The other things that was interesting for me personally was to look at what is a home. And this was quite contentious at the beginning, because women from Western society wanted to be about empowerment, about going out into the world, about finding a place for themselves. And we facilitated the college, which I part of in South Africa, was students from very many different nationalities, from English, Spanish, Indonesian, as well as Xhosa and Zulu and Ndebele tribes of South African Muslims. So it was very interesting to have a cross-cultural perspective and work together this way. And you see that in the D, if one goes back to the sort of basics of D, then you can kind of have flourishment of what all of that meaning might mean.
Absolutely. Often I feel also that in the West and in the last couple of decades, during my formative years as well, and perhaps yours, there was a devaluing of the home and a woman's role in it. So you were a slave to the kitchen sink. Cleaning is looked upon as something demeaning. Even cooking is very demeaning. But these are things that actually cultivate a nurturing, healthy home, which is ultimately the foundation of society. So I personally believe that many women have been pushed away from, having any desire to even be within the home in any, in those typical traditional roles, because it's been so badly stereotyped.
Yes, and when you put a should on top of all of that you should be there, that's when you completely start undermining the fabric of what it is. But essentially, we all have a home, we all have a house, and even if you look at the archetype of what a house is, there's something very profound in our understanding on a deep level. We have, for example, the house of Allah, which is not a literal containment for Allah, but the Kaaba is called the house. And then we have our governing bodies are contained within the houses of parliament. So it's a place of power, it's a place of focus, and then you have what the house is to an individual family. And so if you look at it, which is often a process of reframing how one looks at the importance of things, one can come to a different place, because it's not about saying women should be in the home. It's about looking at what are all the areas of life we find ourselves in, and how can we go to the best of that area. So we might be looking at our career, we might be looking at our marriage, we might be looking about our relations with our neighbours across the street, we might be looking at our health or how we take care of our bodies. And we can also be looking at how we take care of our homes. So I see it as a part of looking at the different aspects of life and wanting to find, how can I go to the best of this? How can I truly appreciate what Allah has given me, and how can I use it for the best of things, the way of being in the world? And for example,
yeah, you just mentioned that it's about reframing the way we look at the home, and you also mentioned the home can be a place of power. So do you think that traditional female role, which was more acquainted with the home, was actually a powerful position? And perhaps the feminism movement, obviously it's done a lot of great stuff as well, but some of the negatives might be that it's it has taken away that ideology or that reality that the home is a place of power for women.
Yeah, and it's a place of meaning as well. If you think of a place that you can reflect in, that you can be safe in, that you can feel at peace in, that's creating an environment where you can reflect with your husband, your children, and it's a place of kind of consolidating what can become a unit, which is important parts of society. And I feel also hospitality is so much a part of so much of all of the cultures where it's like you. And you see more and more that people are becoming individuated, isolated, not having in their houses, but there's an angelic presence with the guests. As we know, when a guest comes to your house, or if you have a visitor to your home in the way of Allah, they come and they bring 70,000 angels. There's an aspect of somebody turns up at your door unannounced. It's like Allah is greeting you. If it's a known guest, it's like the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is greeting you. And there's also narrations that hospitality can, in some circumstances, be on the same level as jihad. So it's the unseen reality of that is really profound, and we have to go back to what's the first thing that Allah says to us in Quran and Surah, is that the whole revelation is for the Allah and who believe in the unseen. So part of, I feel, going back to just this what seems like a simple matter of the home, has so much depth and potential for how we can experience ourselves as a woman, as an individual woman, in her individuality, but also in her sense of togetherness, if she has a housemate, flat share, but also if she's married. And then the children grow up in that ambience of people coming and going, and this openness, which is also a freedom and a release for them from the nuclear family and the psychodramas that can go on between men and women when it's only man and woman in the house.
But as a psychotherapist who's worked with many women, do you find that the sort of, the way that society is going at the moment and the undermining of the home and the female role, do you think that's contributed to psychological problems in men and women that we are seeing, which is increasingly prevalent? Because we are ultimately seeing a fragmentation of the foundation of society, which is a stability.
Yeah, we are. We're seeing the fragmentation of communities, aren't we? Because people might have grown up in one place and stayed in one place, had their families in one place, and so it went on. And now, children, they're leaving home, and it's not just to go to the next county, but it can be the other side of the world. So there is that fragmentation, which can be wonderful in a way. It's expansion, it's adventure, it's taking what this age has afforded us in the way of transport and access to places that we never thought we'd be able to go to. But when it comes to home, I feel like, of course, when you have difficulties in families, the children are exposed to that, they internalize that, and then they can project those internalizations onto the relationships which they have as adults, and then you have a self-perpetuating cycle, which we have the chance of. It's not this life sentence. We have the human spirit, the human will, which calls to transcend that, to find new ways of being, to find new possibilities of being. But I feel like the breakdown that you're referring to, which includes, say, divorce, affecting everybody, whether they're not Muslim or whether they are Muslim. What I would like to say about divorce, which I think is really often overlooked, is, in my experience, possibly about 70 or 80% of divorces can break down because of money, because of a misunderstanding about money, financial responsibilities between man and woman. In the Deen, we have something that is quite unusual compared to British society, historically speaking, where it was only 100 or 200 years ago where in British society, and this will also mean British colonial society, so this is going out not to Britain, but all of the colonies, which, as you know, are extensive. But there was this attitude that when you are married, you become the property of the man, and so does your property. As you know, in the Deen, a man has no rights over his wife's property or her income, but he has the responsibility legally to provide for her housing and her clothing and her food, which might be primitive when one put that. But those are the essentials, and sometimes because it can seem a bit primitive to put it like that, they can actually be completely dismissed. And also, as women who want to be independent, don't want to be so-called reliant, we can not know that we don't have to share our money, but everything becomes 50-50, so that the bills are split 50-50, the mortgage is split 50-50, the food is split 50-50. But that's not how Allah has offered our relationship to be in marriage. So it can be that you do everything 50-50, but it has to be on the basis that both individuals in the couple know that the actual responsibility lies with the man. And
we do hear a lot about that, what the man's role is in Islam in terms of marriage and his responsibilities as a provider and a protector. So we have that clarity, but often we don't really have any clarity as to what the woman's role is. That's not been clearly stated I believe. And what's your views on that?
Yeah, it's not clearly stated legally, but that's because the clarity be about the legal situation of the men. So rather than trying to say, well, then what does the woman have to do? Like the man has to do this, and so she should do that. It's simply not like that.
So how is it?
The point that one comes to is a point of freedom. But then, of course, then we look, if you go to the Deen and you look at the word responsibility, then we see that there's the responsibility a man might have in a marriage and a responsibility that the woman might inevitably have, of course, with childbearing and looking after young children. But what has come from Allah is the joint responsibility of believing men and women who are obedient, men and women who are truthful, men and women who are steadfast, men and women who guard their private parts. There's this aspect of what it is to be together as Muslims and with a different perspective, which is actually going beyond your marriage and going out so that your marriage is of service to beyond the individuals who make the marriage. And as you know, if you go back to the first community, it was telling people about the Deen. So if you see in this country, you're not allowed to be in a country which is not Muslim unless you're waging war or you're doing dawah. So we're not waging war here in Britain because we are, you could say some of us are guests to some extent. So our responsibility is to do dawah, which again is simple, but that's because people make very simple things very difficult.
So as a Muslim woman and a mother of her own children as well, what do you intrinsically, innately feel a woman's role is? I mean, I know you're talking from the perspective of a psychotherapist and from looking at it from a more holistic perspective, but do you have, from your own experience, any personal strong opinions? Like being a mother, you probably recognise that children really need that nurturing, and that homely life. And then they also need a role model of a father. Has that given you insight?
I mean, I could just speak very, very subjectively and in my own experience, which is my own experience. It's not my opinion, but I have really loved being a mother. And I feel grateful that I've loved being a mother, and I have 5 children, and I've had several young children who've lived with us as well. And my sense intuitively is that I put the children first, and then when they're sorted and they're happy, then all the rest of the time is my own. And I have experience of seeing when children are put second, third, or fourth down the line, then they can be much more clingy. And in the end, it doesn't really serve one well because you're neither here nor there. But I do feel that now that my children are older, and I'm really enjoying my experience of counselling and psychotherapy, and it's a whole new world. And as you know, I've written a book, and my husband and I have started travelling to different countries and doing workshops about marriage. So that's all opened up because I know that the children, they're not anymore. But that is subjective.
So in your workshops on marriage, what kind of discoveries do you gain, and what are your primary teachings that you like to emphasize to those who attend? Is there a particular message you like to try and relay?
I like to work collaboratively, so I like to sort of introduce a theme and then really listen to other people's experience and work with that. But I like working with the theme of individuality and togetherness, because I think that's so important in marriage, that we don't lose ourselves to the other. And so how is it that we can maintain who we are and our sense of self and what we want and aspiration, and be alongside another, being in relationship to another with a sense of togetherness and collaboration and working.
Yeah.
And a very useful image I find, which somebody expressed to me when I was first married, was that if you are a couple and you stand looking at each other and relying on each other for all your needs to be met, then that's your direction, that's your qibla, as it were. But if you're face out, but you're side by side together, but you're facing Allah and you're traveling a path to Allah, there's something that I find really something liberating about that somehow.
Absolutely.
That your life isn't dependent on how your marriage works out. I mean, of course, some marriages don't work, and I'm not saying that there's a kind of ideal, and sometimes they shouldn't work, and sometimes divorce is the best, and there's no limit to how many times one can be married either. But
I'd have to say, sorry to cut you, but I do love your concept of marriage and being about individuality and collaboration. So you retain your essence and who you are, but then it's also a collaboration with your partner. So you're both your full selves coming together. And I actually think that is the only way forward, because so many of us in this day and age are so self-actualized, have so much self-awareness, and are so liberated that for men and women to come together in harmony, it has to be mutual, compromising, and collaborative. And I personally think that is the model going forward for a successful marriage.
Yeah, I totally agree. And so potently that this thing of self-awareness, which so many of, which is the buzzword nowadays, awareness. But if you can have awareness till kingdom come, but if it's not coupled with will, what's it for, really? So that sense of collaboration and coming together with a sense of purpose, because you're sharing meanings and values. A lot of self-awareness, and then being aware of what I need and what's good for me, and then you kind of counter this other person, like they've got their own needs, and how's that going to work out? But essentially one's always having to go beyond oneself in order to collaborate, to stay in relationship with another, just as in any relationship, really, in family or work, or in intimate relationships. And then going beyond that as a couple. So when you have two individuals who come together, if they are respectful and almost protect one another's individuality to some degree, then instead of chopping off bits of them so that they are reduced, then what you have is a couple who is more than the sum of two individuals. And then likewise, you go into society with other couples, and then you can be, the potential is that you can be more than the sum of the couples, as it were. And that's ideally what one would want. But I think just have an image of that is useful, because we all die our own death. We die to some, literally. And so to have that sense of purpose for oneself and to hold on to that and to try and work with that with your spouse is of immense benefit. And this might sound strange, but I want to take it back to the matter of finances, which I know sounds very strange, but in my experience of these workshops, it's often the men feeling like, oh gosh, I just didn't realize it was my responsibility. And we've been going 50-50, and then the woman becomes resentful, but she doesn't know why she's resentful because everything's 50-50 though. So there's something there which I feel, I'm not going to say should be done, but I feel that I would encourage to revisit how they understand their finances.
And I know you just mentioned there that women can get subconsciously or consciously resentful when a man isn't playing that financial provider's role or is doing 50-50. Is there anything that frustrates a man internally when a woman isn't fulfilling certain roles beyond the obvious?
I'm sure there is. I don't know if I could perhaps number them. I'm sure there's as many as there are gripes that we have with anybody and everybody who we kind of have relationships with. And again, I'm not saying that women should be in the home and the man should be out working and providing everything, because as you know, if you look to the Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and his first wife, Lady Khadija, she was incredibly wealthy. And so, that was an example. A marriage and the finances in the marriage still was the same, that he had a responsibility to her regardless of what wealth she had and how much worked. And often she's tagged with Khadija, the businesswoman. I'm sure that there was many other aspects of her womanhood in which she was like an extraordinary woman. Otherwise, when she died, why did people call it the Year of Sorrow? She was an extraordinary woman in many different ways, but this aspect is because we might find it to be usual as the go-to for saying, yes, but women shouldn't be in the home, she can be this. But I'm sure there's many a man who would like to come home for a nice, to a nice cooked meal every night. But there are some men who that's not what they might want. Some men, their career is maybe more important than their family sometimes. Some men might not even want to get married. So it's as many as there are people on the planet.
Yeah. I think ultimately it comes down to, whether we're looking at it from a non-religious perspective or we're looking at it from an Islamic perspective, I think it all comes down to love. If you can have love in that relationship, you're going to compromise, you're going to collaborate, you're going to meet one another's needs, and that is what will ultimately, result in harmony and happiness and a happy, functioning home.
And I would couple it with respect as well.
Absolutely,
because when there can be too much love, it's obsession. And when there's too little love, it's neglect. And when it's the wrong kind of love, it's abuse. So I would couple that with respect and also bowing down, putting one's head on the ground, doing the prayer together, for example. I remember one very wise man of Allah saying, establish the prayer in your homes, because if you don't do that, then the person with the strongest nafs will dominate us. And it could be the 3-year-old. But by establishing the prayer, even if it's just praying one time a day in the evening, you establish some sense of order and regularity and worship as well, which, of course, is barakah into the home. And it reminds us of this path. It's a path that we're on, and not to look to the other for all of one's needs and sense of happiness and needs of love to be met.
As always, fascinating and so insightful speaking with you, Aisha. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you.
That's it for this week from Aisha in the Spotlight. Hope you enjoyed today's show. I'll be back very soon with the next episode.